Welcome back to the BPSA Beyond Dispensary podcast. In today's episode, I'll be speaking to a third year pharmacy student from the University of Huddersfield, Katie. She'll be sharing her experience of what it's like to live with hidden disabilities and what we can do as future professionals to support those with chronic conditions. Hi Katie, welcome to the podcast. Would you mind just quickly introducing yourself?
So my name's Katie, so I'm a third year pharmacy student at the University of Huddersfield.
Great. We're going to be talking about hidden disabilities today. Would you mind just explaining what hidden disability is?
So for me, I have 4 different diagnoses. So I have neuropathic pain, and then anxiety, depression, and then my other diagnosis is hyperhidrosis, which is hidden and isn't hidden at the same time. It's one of the things that people misunderstand quite a lot because it's excessive sweating. So for me, that's in my face. So it's one of the things that I think gets misunderstood more than the others because people just aren't aware that it exists.
Thank you for sharing that. Would you mind just sharing a little bit more about your diagnosis and maybe a bit more about your story? What led you up to your diagnosis?
So for me, it started in the June of 2020. So I was in lockdown like everybody else. I was a year 11 student who college didn't want me yet and high school didn't want me yet, so I was just kind of sat at home. I kind of tried to access the GP surgery, but obviously things were really, really limited. So that was when the chronic pain in my left shoulder started, and everybody kind of just went, "Oh, you slept on it wrong. You've probably done something that you don't realise that you've done," because people were kind of doing more at home. So I repeatedly tried to contact the GP surgery and had a lot of telephone appointments, which obviously didn't meet my needs at the time because I needed somebody to come and kind of look at me, because me and mum were both sat there and we were like, well, I don't know if something looks wrong or not, because I didn't know enough. Eventually in the June of 2022, so 2 years later, I actually managed to get a referral to trauma and orthopaedics, which was one of the best and worst things I ever did. So I managed to get the referral. I saw them at the end of July, and had a really, really lovely orthopaedic registrar who sat there and kind of listened to the whole thing and kind of agreed with me that she felt that I had been, in her words, failed by the NHS, because something should have been done before we got to the point of 2 years. And she told me that, this is that we've discussed you, this is the plan with the consultant, this is what we're doing. I've sent you off for a contrast MRI. We have marked it as urgent because this should have been done a year ago. And then I had that contrast MRI at the end of August. And I remember it being such a strange experience because it was down as urgent, I got shoved on the front of a routine cardiac list for people that come in once a year. And they usually don't do contrast for those people, so the contrast team were in. It was like 7:30. I was in Dewsbury Hospital, of course couldn't have anyone with me because we were still under all the COVID stuff. Nobody seemed to really know whether they were coming or going. I remember it being a really, really strange experience. I then had a follow-up appointment after that scan, which is when they agreed that structurally there is very, very little wrong with my shoulder. So when you kind of look on it, how your shoulder sits is you kind of have the socket and how it sits. So this part of my shoulder allows this part to move more than it should, but not enough to cause the pain levels that I have. So that was when they said, look, we think this is going to be a management situation rather than fixing it. At the time I was 18, and they went, we can, if you really want us to, we can do surgery, but we don't think it's going to make it any better, because anything we do try and fix, you're then going to have kind of the battles with scar tissue and that kind of thing. So I chose to manage that. They then referred me to a specialist physiotherapist, and I saw her a couple of weeks later for the first time. So I think that was the end of October, start of November, and saw her right through until the June of 2023. So I was at Dewsbury Hospital once a week pretty much. So in the September of 2022, that was when I started at Huddersfield doing pharmacy. So my first year, I always say to people, I remember sitting in lectures, I remember doing lecture content. I don't remember a lot else that happened outside of that. So I had, obviously I was going to Dewsbury once a week. I had my grandma had got diagnosed with terminal cancer in the October of first year, so I was kind of balancing that with her being at home, and everybody not really knowing how long we had. So the October was when I received my depression diagnosis. So it came out of finding out that grandma was terminal. But if you ask Mom, she's always said it's been on the cards from probably the March of 2022, and I think that's something that I now recognise, but didn't then, because it is very hard. Because I think particularly when you want to go into healthcare, you see the sickest of the sickest, and I think you don't then want to get help yourself because you believe that you're not sick enough. And I think that's something that a lot of people who have a disability in general, but a lot of us that work in the NHS that fall in that category, do, because we see the people who in our minds are sicker. And then the June of 2023, physio basically turned around and went that this is it, this is all we can do for you. And then from there onwards, it was then managed by the GP surgery. So my kind of experience with the GP surgery has been positive and negative. So I kept, even though I moved to Huddersfield for university, I kept the same GP surgery. Because even though I only live about 45 minutes outside of Huddersfield, it would have meant moving to a different NHS hospital trust. So I basically decided that if we were keeping it all the same, because it can affect waitlists and things, which I think is something that a lot of us face when you move, is that some trusts kind of look at when you join the list and then move you to the equivalent place on their list. Some will just put you right at the bottom, which obviously if you've been waiting 6 months or more, you can for some wait lists be near the top, and then you're then almost doubling, particularly if you're going to an area that has a longer wait time than the one you lived in. So I know there's people who haven't moved house because they want to move house, but they haven't moved because they don't want to move around wait lists, which I think is something that there needs to be something in place where if you're moving areas, I'm not suggesting that we start bumping people to the top of the list, but it's like, okay, so if I joined a list for Mid Yorkshire Trust in June of this year, and then I moved to Calverdale Trust and I joined their list in June, moving to that kind of place and looking at it that way.
Yeah, that was amazing. Thank you for sharing all of that. And I just wanted to say, I'm really sorry for your experiences, but I think just the fact that you're sharing it and you're happy to speak about it makes a real difference to people. So thank you so much. And I just wanted to ask, did your diagnosis maybe influence your path into pharmacy, or is that kind of like a separate?
So for me, Mum was a nurse and now works for the Open University as a practice tutor, so helping students on placement. So I always kind of knew I wanted to go into healthcare. So for me, kind of when I was picking university choice and things, one of the considerations was what can I do? So for me, it was okay. So can I do this? No, because that requires lifting patients and things like that, which at the time I couldn't do at all. And then one of my chemistry A-level teacher, who also suffered from chronic pain, said, well, have you thought about pharmacy, because you wouldn't necessarily have to do the manual parts that you would have to in other professions. And I kind of went, okay, that really kind of fitted with me. There's a lot of different career kind of choices, community, hospital, GP, all of kind of those things. So it was more that I'd made a decision and that kind of influenced my choices, rather than necessarily did help me pick one because it eliminated quite a few, but it wasn't necessarily an experience that I had.
Yeah, again, thank you for sharing that. You've just touched on it a little bit there. What are some kind of challenges that people with hidden disabilities have?
So I think particularly people who have any sort of kind of pain diagnosis, whatever that might be, or something along those lines. A lot of us fall under the category of dynamic disabilities, which is where a great example is somebody who say got Ehlers-Danlos. One day, you see walking around to what a lot of the public's perception is fine, and then the following day they could be on crutches. They could be in a wheelchair. It could be that they use those things based on what activities they're doing during the day. And I think sometimes, it's one day you can do something, one day you can't. And I think sometimes trying to get people to understand that it's not that we didn't need it that day, it's that sometimes it's about having independence, because whilst lots of disability aids do give you independence, they give you independence in different ways. So I think sometimes it's about, because you can do something today doesn't mean you can do it tomorrow. And I think sometimes trying to get people who have never experienced that can be quite interesting. So, like, one of my experiences when I first came to uni, so I moved into a flat with people who I didn't know. And it was things like I needed a ground floor flat just because of like stairs and carrying things upstairs. And lots of people were like, but you like plan when you do everything. And like, so for me, it's about, so shopping, for instance, is something that I find a lot easier now, but I used to find quite difficult. So kind of carrying shopping bags and things. So it used to be that I would kind of look at what my week looked like and picked the day either that I knew that I could be iller the following day, or knew that I could do it in the morning and then rest during the day to then not be worse tomorrow. And I think it's kind of some of those decisions that I think people don't always understand. And it's kind of like that mental checklist that you do when you kind of are going through and planning your week. So I always say it's like, so when I go to uni, I have various different meds that I may or may not need in my bag. I know when I go to uni that there will be somewhere for me to buy food if I need food and buy a drink. But if I'm going somewhere that's new, or if I'm going somewhere that's outdoors, I then need to think about bringing those things with me, which then for me potentially adds extra weight to a bag, which I think sometimes a lot of people don't realise some of the decision fatigue that we get around this, because it's the extra things you have to think about before you even stepped out the door, kind of in the morning, and how you kind of what goes through your head. So they're not necessarily things that I do out loud, they're just things that I kind of think about when I'm doing stuff. So like if I obviously only keep so many sets of meds in my handbag, but like I've got a set in my handbag, a set in my uni bag, some in the car, and it's about thinking about, the expiry dates on those meds. So when do I need to swap them out? Where do I need them? So like I have a set at mum and dad's house. Where are other places that I need them? So actually when I go to that place I don't have to think about that. And I think that's something that not everybody realise, that that's what actually goes on sometimes inside people's heads.
Yeah, that's really important. Thank you. I think, especially as future healthcare professionals, the fact that you've highlighted so many of these things that people may not know or may not even consider, it's really important that we're having this conversation. So, thank you so much. So at university, have you received any extra support, or do you think that there could be more support in place for people with disabilities?
So for me, when I went round university, it was one of the things I looked at. I knew that I wanted to move out because I wanted almost like that extra challenge of moving out, because I knew that it was kind of potentially more of a safe environment to move out in. Like if it didn't work out, there was things we could do about it. So for me, I went and looked at a lot of universities, and some of them that I really, really liked didn't offer the support for people who didn't have a specific diagnosis. So for me, my neuropathic pain diagnosis came the April of 2024. And that was more because I went to see a GP and I went, I'm taking, I think at that point I was taking 24 different individual tablets on a morning as a 19-year-old. It's like this is the sort of thing that you see in dosets when you're looking at people in care homes. And he went, well, let's stop doing in the box because in the box isn't working. So he tried me on amitriptyline, and for me that's been completely life-changing. So that was more where my diagnosis came out of, was actually because somebody tried something different. And it's like, okay, well, if this works, we now know that it is some sort of, kind of nerve issue, central nervous system issue. Because that happened in my second year, I was kind of going around universities and going, I've got healthcare professionals that will agree there is an issue. They're happy to kind of write documentation that explains what they think my needs are. I can kind of back that up. And a lot of them went no diagnosis, no support. And I think that's something that's so heartbreaking. So I went to universities and I really, really enjoyed the experience, and I liked the course. I liked the lecturers that I spoke to, and it's like, well, I can't live an hour and a half away from home and be told that I get nothing. And I think for me, my college couldn't supply me with a lot because they have a lot more red tape when it comes to allowing you support for A-level exams, for instance, because working diagnoses aren't as much of a thing, whereas universities don't have that same issue. A lot of them, it is about what they do internally. So for me, that's one of the reasons I chose Huddersfield. I remember going to an open day. I remember being really ill, not wanting to go, and Dad saying, Dad looked when it was a polytechnic many, many years ago, but it was just slightly too far from his dad. And he said, look, let's just go. You can stand on campus. If you absolutely hate it, then there's no point in us going. And I remember going, and I think we spent over 3 hours there in the end. And I remember speaking to two students who were second year and a fourth year, and the fourth year in particular had kind of interruptions to her studies. Things had happened, and I remember the lecturer saying, how he'd kind of, what the university's kind of how the support mechanism looked like for the university. And I remember going and talking to Disability Services, and they were the only university that could turn around to me and went, if a healthcare professional will write on a piece of paper that you have a problem and this is what it is, we think, but we don't know, we can do something with that. And I think it's crazy that I went to so many universities and that was the only one that would do anything without a diagnosis. I think when we live in an age where wait lists are getting longer and longer and longer, so diagnosis times are getting longer and longer and longer, that we're not valuing working diagnoses. And I definitely think across the whole board of universities there is more everybody could be doing. But I know that from my experience, that was kind of the one where I felt the most supported. But I know I've spoken to other people who have had positive experiences at other universities who turned around to me and said no. And I think that's where the inconsistency comes in. And I think that's such, there needs to be some sort of consistent kind of ruling about how, how do we define support for university students. So I remember being told by my disability advisor, he went, I don't know whether you'll get disabled students allowance, which you can access through Student Finance England, but there's no harm in you putting in an application and seeing what they say. I remember putting in that application and getting all the documentation together and sending it off, and then turning around and going, yeah, that's fine, we've set up a needs assessment for you. And I'm thinking, if the funding body that's going to pay for my support will take my working diagnosis, why won't other universities? And I just think there's such a disconnect between the systems. So, people, and I think some of that is that people have such varied experience, even with very, very similar conditions. You get told one thing by one person and then one thing by another, and then actually neither of them are completely right and something else happens in the middle. And I think a lot of it depends on kind of the support system that you have. So I remember going to Huddersfield on that day and speaking to Andy Adams, who at the time was the admissions tutor, who's unfortunately no longer with us. And I remember saying to Mum after speaking to him that this was now my first choice. And I think that one conversation with somebody who I'd never met before, who was so kind of sympathetic and understood my situation, changed everything for me. Because I genuinely sit here and think, if I'd gone to a different university, I'm not actually sure I'd still be a pharmacy student. And I think that that's crazy, that there's universities who we all have, we all come out with a very, very similar degree because they're all accredited, but some of us might not be there, or might be there based on the support the university provides. And I think that that's where the issue kind of stems from, is kind of to do with that support that the university offers. I think that is such a big thing that we have to consider when you go for an open day, or when you're looking at where you're going. A lot of people, a lot of times, a lot of parents kind of just walk past wellbeing and disability and don't pay it any mind. And there's other people who are sitting there for 45 minutes trying to understand if their child will be able to succeed and live in this space. And I just think that there needs to be something in place so that these experiences aren't so different from university to university, but also aren't so different from person to person. And I think if you address the person to person problem, you can then address the disparity between universities.
Yeah, I think that's really, really important. Such a powerful story as well that you've had there. It's really amazing to think that you've had such a positive experience, and that you can inspire the students, but it's so essential that people are looking for these services, ensuring that they are the same between universities. So I'm really glad you brought that up. It's that time of year again. Autumn area conferences. Don't forget, the BPSA will be coming to a university near you. Watch out on our socials for the date, time and specific location. How have your experiences as a patient shaped the way you interact with your patients yourself? So maybe on placement or even as a future professional?
I think for me, one of the big things that I kind of see a lot, I particularly think of an instance when I was on a hospital placement, is that sometimes patients are labelled into boxes. I think particularly different healthcare professionals look at different parts of the patient, and sometimes if you look just at a patient's medications, you can make assumptions based on that patient. And I always think there's this kind of space where, yes, we should absolutely be looking at, say, the patient's repeat list to kind of get a sense for, what on here getting an idea for your patient before you meet them, but also hearing the patient's story, because I know that if you looked at my repeat list and then came to speak to me, they sometimes say two very different things. So, and I think particularly there's a lot of people who assume that because a person has opioid painkillers on repeat and orders them regularly, there's an issue there. And there is an issue there, because have we fully addressed the reason why they are taking those painkillers? And if the answer is yes, and unfortunately there isn't anything we can do about it, have they got suitable mechanisms in place to mitigate any side effects they're going to get from that? Instead of just assuming that because somebody regularly orders pain medication, they're therefore drug seeking. So I remember I think I was going on placement, and I was going kind of away from Huddersfield, and it was the time where I said, look, I'm going on placement, I'm going away. I know I'm not due to order my pain medication yet, but this is kind of the reasons why I need to order it. I got the email from the university that says that this is where I'm going. You can kind of see that this is my council tax letter that says that this is where I live, and you can kind of see that I'm obviously not living in Huddersfield if I'm going to this place. And I remember then being accused of drug seeking, and I remember it took me 18 months to get that out of my GP patient record, because it stops a lot of doors. So it stopped me being able to repeat order pain medication. So that meant that every single time I needed anything, I would have to go in person. My GP surgery, it meant that they limited how much you could get at once. So I remember there was one GP who turned around to me and went, okay, so I can give you some. I can give you 56 tablets of 15 milligram codeine. And I went, well, that's going to last me not even 4 days. And he went, what do you mean? And I went, well, you're only giving me 15 milligram tablets, and I take 64 times a day, because at that point in my life I was maxed out on codeine. So I'm going to go and collect that from my pharmacy this evening. I'm going to take at least one dose, if not two, today, which means that in 3 days I'm going to be sat here back in your office wasting a 10-minute GP's appointment because the GP who didn't know me and hadn't read into my records and hadn't listened to me made an assumption because of something I had on repeat. And I think that's such a, I say that to all the healthcare professionals, and they're like, really, is that what they did? And I remember for me, it really exacerbated my mental health conditions, because it was not only, if I was taking that level of codeine, it was not only, so I'd have to drive to the GP surgery, you've then got to sit, they're not always running on time, you've then got to go to the appointment, they've then got to sign it, the pharmacy obviously have to process it, then you've got to go and pick it up, that's then potentially me driving back to the house to then drive back out to go to the pharmacy. And it's like, but if I'm taking 240 milligrams of codeine in a day, they're advising you that potentially you shouldn't be driving. And these two things don't add up. And I was in the fortunate position where my mum worked from home and could change her schedule based on that, but that isn't everybody's reality. And I think that one healthcare professional really ruined my relationship with GPs, and it took a very, very long time for me to go back to a GP with any level of confidence. So I remember I used to have, say, a routine appointment. It used to be, right, okay, so me and mum used to have to block out that appointment, and then it used to be that I used to have a note on my phone, and me and mum would discuss what I'm going to say and write it down, and then I'd have to have all the dates written down so I could tell them if they tried to accuse me of drug seeking or if they needed more information, what date that was in my GP record. And I know that GPs are under a lot of pressure. I really do get that, but I think that, so there is individuals who drug seek, that is a reality, But just because somebody requires pain medication long term, that doesn't mean they fit in that category. There is other reasons why that might be somebody, and I think for me that kind of started my kind of journey with the GP surgery and wanting to advocate for patients. So I remember it was my second day at Huddersfield, and they brought in our patient participation group to kind of stand at the front and tell us their stories, and that was the first time I'd ever heard somebody use the word medical gaslighting. And I remember listening to, I think, 3 of the group, and I remember thinking, oh my God, that's what they did to me. That's what this was. And it wasn't something that I was kind of aware particularly that existed. I knew it was something that happened, but it's always that thing, you never think it's going to happen to you. And I think one of the big things about medical gaslighting is that advocating for yourself. And I think that, I sometimes sit here and I think, but what about those patients that can't? Because there is patients who, for whatever reason, can't advocate for themselves. And, I think about, things that I've seen, or things that, I've spoken up and said something, and it's like, well, what would have happened to that person if I hadn't been there? Or I think sometimes, with granddad and grandma, when I've kind of rang up and I've gone, but this isn't right. What if they hadn't have had me? There is particularly elderly patients who don't have family that live near enough to be able to kind of see the situation that's happening. And I think the big takeaway for medical gaslighting from me is that I have never been medically gaslit by a male GP. It has always been female GPs. And I think that's something that when I tell people, everybody's surprised, because I think male GPs sometimes get such a bad rep for medically gaslighting women. And I think it does happen 100%. But every time I've been accused of drug seeking, every time somebody has medically gaslit me or told me it's because of my anxiety, or that it isn't something because of my age, or it is or isn't something because I'm a woman, it has always been a female GP. I remember going for an appointment with a male GP and coming out, and I rang mum straight away, so she assumed something was wrong, and I went, he didn't bring up my age, or my gender, or my mental health. He asked me how the exacerbation of my current condition was affecting my mental health, but not that my mental health was causing this. And I think there's such a fine line that you tread, because mental health conditions cause physical symptoms. It happens to me. It is real, but there needs to be a line where it isn't just, oh, I can see you're diagnosed with anxiety. Is it just that? And I always think that we should be looking at that when we've ruled out everything else. We've ruled out it being a condition. Then we look at, well, is it the anxiety? Is it the mental health condition? Is it actually that you're taking medication and that's actually causing this problem? Instead of just assuming that it's immediately the mental health condition. I remember coming out of that appointment and being just completely amazed, because in my head, because of my experiences, GPs just didn't do that. And for a very, very long time, I refused to see GPs. And that in the long term, it didn't compromise my patient care, but I know other people whose patient care has been compromised because they won't see a GP because they've been accused of something that isn't actually what's happening if you read into what's happening. So for me, if they'd pulled up my document discharge letter from the consultant from trauma and orthopedics, it would have said that, this was the plan going forward, this is what had been agreed, this is what he suggested. If this doesn't work, we're going to try this. If these 2 things don't work, then please refer her back to us and we'll look at it. But that he believed it was something that there wasn't a fix for, so it needed to kind of be managed. And I think I that one letter, and I remember it's one side of A4, and most of that information is the logo and my address and the GP's address. It isn't actually information. It's not a whole side of A4 of information. It's about 6 lines. And I remember thinking, but if you just read those 6 lines, it would have made such a big difference to my impression of GPs as a whole. But now, anytime I have to see a new GP, I get very, very anxious about it, because I have a preconception because of past experiences, and it is an assumption that I'm making about them because somebody assumed about me. And there's people who say, well, yeah, but she might be different. And some of them are, and there is a couple that I've met, but I think your experience shapes your healthcare journey so much that I think people need to, think about what they're saying. Or a lot of patients now have access to most of their GP record. So if you're writing things, you need to think about what you're writing that other healthcare professionals can see, but also that potentially the patient can see. And about, how are we looking at this? So I remember from that appointment I had where the GP was amazing, he kind of wrote out, okay, so if she doesn't see me, this is what I've done, this is what we've agreed is happening next. And he wrote, yes, I understand the patient has mental health diagnoses, however, I do not currently believe that this is the cause. Should those 3 lines of inquiry run out, then maybe you need to rediscuss this with the patient, which is what we'd agreed. And I think it all comes back to patient-centred care, is that you are the person who sat in every single appointment. I think now there's such a carousel of GPs going round that very often, even if you're going back for a follow-up, you're not seeing the same person, and you're having to spend the first 5 minutes of your 10-minute appointment explaining how you've got to be sat in the room. And I think there's a reason why GP appointments aren't long enough. And it's not always that 10 minutes isn't long enough to deal with the problem. It's that it takes you 5 minutes to actually get to the problem. And making GP's appointments longer isn't going to fix that problem. Making it so that there is clear records and there's clear understanding of the patient, I think, is the way that we go forward. And I think it's really easy. Very often people go, well, you say all of this, but then what a pharmacist supposed to do about it? And I think there's so many times where, I'm very, very lucky that we have a pharmacist and a pharmacy technician that work full-time in the GP surgery. And I know I've had more than one conversation with them, and I've gone, okay, look, I get that there is, and I totally believe that we should educate patients on the fact that there is risks to opioid pain medication, because there is. There is a risk of dependence, and there's a whole host of side effects. But if that is what the patient needs to get through the day, we then need to look at how we're managing that. And I know I had that conversation with the pharmacist, and I said, look, I know it causes dependence. I don't get any major side effects from it, apart from when I'm taking 240 milligrams. And realistically, when I'm taking that, I'm not actually doing a lot anyway. So the fact that I'm dizzy doesn't really matter, because I'm not getting up out of bed. And she went, okay, that's fine. You clearly understand the conversation that we're having. She documented that, and I know that she put on so that, and when I then went through their system to request pain medication, because it went to her to authorise. So she went through and she said, yes, this is suitable for this patient. Yes, this patient understands. Yes, it meets our in-practice protocol. And then a GP signed it off, because the GP could see clearly that the pharmacist, who was very experienced and knew that they had spoken to me, knew what was going on, and that I understood the risks and the benefits of treatment, but that I wanted to go ahead.
Wow, you've made some such essential points there, and you've pretty much been answering all my questions. I don't even need to ask. There's just one main thing that I've sort of realised as you've been speaking. I've been like a counter assistant dispenser for a few years, and I think I've seen both the sides of the story that you're painting. So the experience of not getting those medications on time or having struggles, I've seen that a lot through patients, and more with stock issues. And then also that other side of having someone intervene properly and having those conversations and providing that support. So I'm just wondering, As pharmacists, how can we support people with chronic conditions? Are there things we need to be saying more often, or are there things that we can directly do to support patients?
I think particularly with patients, particularly community pharmacy, I think plays such an important role in that kind of monthly check-in. So a lot of us get meds monthly and you go every 4 weeks and you see your pharmacist. And I think just having that little check-in there, even if they're a patient that they're on these medications, they've been on them for a while, there's clearly not a lot of GP intervention happening because they are stable clinically. Just because somebody is clinically stable doesn't necessarily mean that they're stable as a whole. And that's not me assuming that people who have chronic health conditions always have mental health conditions, but there is such a huge link. And I remember speaking to mental health specialists and them saying to me, they always believe that I would have been a person who at some point in my life had got mental health diagnoses, but they think if it wasn't for my experience, I wouldn't need to take medication to get through the day. And I think that little check-in that you do in a pharmacy where, you kind of look and you go, oh, that patient's ordering pain medication more regularly. Do we need to maybe just have a little quick conversation because they're clearly up in the dose? Is there side effects? Is there something really easy that we can do? Like with opioid pain medication, lots of people get constipated. Is there something really easy that we can do where we sell them something over the counter and that for some people prevents a GP's appointment, or for some others a hospital admission? And I think there's pharmacy sometimes get stuck in a very sticky wicket. I think of Saturday mornings particularly, where you don't have the GP and the GP has done something or not done something that the patient needs. And sometimes people with long-term health conditions, they don't want to go to out of hours because you will never see the same person at out of hours, because that's the sense of out of hours, is it's people who pick up shifts here and there. But it's then also about this continuity of care, as if they're constantly having to go to out of hours because GPs haven't signed scripts, or because they have processed all their other medication, but they don't want to give them this one because they want to see them on Monday. It's like, okay, but could we give them enough to get through the weekend and then see them on Monday? I think sometimes we kind of end up on the front line, where sometimes we're stood there, particularly as a counter dispenser, and you've got a patient who is sometimes very, very unwell and very, very scared, because some of them, they know what will happen if they do not get this medication, and some of them know that the consequences for them can be really serious. So I know that when there was one of my medications, there was a big stock issue. And I kept saying to GP surgery, look, there's a stock issue with the tablets. There isn't with the capsules. Please, can we just change my repeats to capsules? I said, look, I've gone online. I said, I've even given you the shortage protocol that the NHS have put out. The thing that you, and I know the pharmacy have sent you the same thing and told you the same thing. Well, yes, but capsules are more expensive. They are, but a hospital admission is even more expensive than the capsules, because for a lot of people, that's what happens. Because when you have a chronic health condition, the management of that and having this continuous level of care and this continuous kind of control of it, if you have a dip, even if that's just a day's medication you've missed, that can take weeks to fix. And I think just pharmacists, checking in with patients and being like, and having that conversation around mental health. I think particularly because so many of us do suffer from mental health issues because of chronic health conditions, and some of it is because what we've experienced. Some of it is just living with that condition and kind of learning a new normal. I think, and being able to kind of direct people towards things that they can be doing. So if there is a local kind of self-referral service for mental health, if there is a local support group, those kind of things. Or sometimes it's you having that conversation and going, okay, actually, I need to contact the GP and I need to tell the GP that I am concerned that this patient's mental health is suffering and that it's potentially going to spiral. And I think there's so much for doing something before we get to that point, and doing something before people get to crisis, whether that be with their mental health or with their long-term health conditions. Some people turn up and they go, okay, I'm coming to you now because things are going wrong, but they haven't gone really wrong yet. Can we do something about it now? And a lot of the time it's, oh yes, but because the wait lists are so long and they're so busy dealing with the people that are in crisis that need the help right now, there's then actually more people who are getting to that point because there isn't support earlier. And I think having pharmacists in GP practices who can identify patients who are potentially going to be at risk, or having mental health nurses who say are attached to a group of GP practices who know the local area and know the group and can offer real support, whether that be that they see you once every 6 weeks or once every 2 months as a routine standing appointment, because a lot of us have a yearly health review appointment. A lot happens in a year. And just because, and it might be that actually on that day you go in for your appointment, it's okay that day. So you tell them it's okay, but actually in 2 days' time, it isn't okay anymore. And sometimes it takes a healthcare professional asking you if it's all okay, and you have to say yes, and then you go home and you process for you to actually realise that it's not. And I think there's this big thing because it's always advertised on the news about how there's a shortage of GPs and there's a shortage of appointments, and about, going, trying to use the NHS sparingly. But I think there's people who, like what I said at the beginning, they think they're not sick enough. And I think it's, how do we stop these people before they get to be sick enough? There's nothing currently, there's very, very little in place for the in-between. What do we do for the people who aren't yet sick enough, but will be if we don't do something about it? And I think, community pharmacies, just checking in, it's somewhere that that patient is going to go. Like, none of us particularly enjoy spending our Saturday morning touring round, but it's somewhere that they're going to come because they need, and when that's come in. And it might be that actually, that this person's yearly review was a couple of months ago because something got changed or something got optimised. And actually, has anybody checked in since that yearly review? Somebody sent them a text message and said that they hope they're okay, and you've replied back and said yes. And then that is the end of the conversation. And I think there's such a big role that pharmacies can play in just helping patients cope with the day-to-day and cope with, the things that they feel don't need a GP's appointment. So that they're having this side effect for medication. And I think sometimes the relief of the patient when you turn around and go, oh, okay, yeah, that happens to a lot of people. It's a side effect, it can get worse, it can go away, it can change with how much you're taking. If it's a medication, that they up and down. But here, take this and see how you get on with this. And then in a month they come back and they go, but that thing was amazing. And it's maybe 2 minutes of your time that you've spent. And I think it's such a magical role that we can play in people's healthcare journeys as being somebody that's easily accessible. We're open more hours than other places. You don't always have to go to your pharmacy. I think that's such a really, really big thing that, I happen to be lucky enough that my local pharmacy is open 7 days a week, but I know ones I've used in the past have been open, 6 days a week or 5 days a week, or we do weird and wonderful things at bank holidays and that kind of thing. But there will always be one open. It doesn't matter whether it is Eid or Christmas or Easter, there will be one somewhere in your local area that is open, and the NHS on their website will publish which one it is, and will tell you what they can and can't offer you. And I think it's such a big thing because if you present to a pharmacy and the pharmacist goes, actually, I really think you need to see a GP about it, or I really think you need to go to out of hours, or I really think you need to go to urgent treatment or A&E, that patient then feels so much secure going to those services, because if they get challenged, you can sit there and go, a pharmacist has, you're going to send me to the pharmacy, but I've been there and the pharmacist has said to me I need to be here. And I think there's patients who they can advocate for themselves then, because you've almost given them that power that somebody else who's a medical professional has said that this needs looking at, not tomorrow, not in a month, but now.
Yeah, absolutely. I think there's definitely an aspect there of when we do our accuracy checks, when we do our legal checks, having that mental health check as well. I think that's so important, especially like the role that we play and having those essential, and like you just mentioned there, the power that we have, the voice that we can give to our patients. I think that's so important. Now I'm going to go on to some quick fire questions. Would that be okay with you?
Yeah.
Okay. So when you're revising, do you prefer to revise with music or without music?
So I always revise with music, with something on. I very often, if I'm kind of in my study space, I don't do headphones very often. I do them at uni, but I don't do them here. So very often, if I'm with my partner and we both have something on, it's sometimes like, okay, one of us is going to have to put headphones in at this point, because we can both just hear each other's.
And what's your favourite module or part of your degree?
So I really, really enjoy pharmacy practice, but I really enjoy patients. I think that's the kind of, and placement, I think that's the thing where in my head, you get to see the hard work pay off, because every time you go on placement, there's something you can answer or something you could do that you couldn't do last time. Whether that's last year or, we're lucky enough to go twice a year. So whether it's when I go on placement in December, I then go on placement in April, whether it's I can do something in April that I couldn't do in December, I think it's that you kind of get to see it in real time in front of you.
Lovely. And finally, if you could be any drug, what drug would you be?
So, my favourite colour is blue. So I really, really like, it's very, very specific, the amitriptyline, the 10 mg ones that Teva make, that are bright, bright blue. I always think they're so pretty when you're like putting them in dosettes. Very often we get dosettes and they're all white. And I always think that just having like that little bit of colour, I think it makes them look almost less intimidating. Because they've just got that little bit of colour, that little bit of something about them.
I really love that. And finally, I just want to say like a massive thank you for coming on the podcast today. I really think we've had some really good conversations and think people can learn from what we said, and especially students, pharmacy students, we can definitely apply the things that you've been saying into our practice.
Yeah, no, thank you so much for having me.
Thank you. Thank you for listening to this episode of the podcast. I hope that Katie's experiences have made you think about the way you interact with patients. I know there's lots of things I'm going to apply to my next placement and when I'm next working. Thank you for listening, and see you next time as we go further beyond the dispensary.